This is part 4 of your Chapter 7 lecture notes. And I mentioned to you when we first started discussing cellular respiration that we don't just eat carbohydrates. We consume other foods besides carbohydrates. So what happens to those? And the answer is that they enter the cellular respiration pathways at different points. Carbohydrates primarily break down into glucose. No matter what the carbohydrate, it typically breaks down into glucose or some simple sugar, some monosaccharide. And so they enter cellular respiration at the glycolysis step. Some amino acids and glycerol. Glycerol comes from fats or lipids. There should be a comma there. So carbohydrates, amino acids, and glycerol, some amino acids and glycerol can enter at the glycolysis step. Remember, there are 10 chemical reactions in glycolysis, so they don't always enter the very first reaction. They may enter at a different point. Some amino acids, different types of amino acids, enter at the oxidation of pyruvate step. And in other words, that means they're probably converted to pyruvate. And fatty acids as well as other amino acids. So amino acids, it all depends on which amino acid that it is. Remember, there are 20 different types of amino acids. So the various types of amino acids can enter at different points during the cycle. But fatty acids and some amino acids can enter at the citric acid cycle. So if that happens, they're more than likely converted to acetyl coenzyme A. And here is an overview of amino acids that enter the citric acid cycle. Depending on the amino acids are listed in the little green boxes. So we know the citric acid cycle begins with acetyl coenzyme A. So and acetyl coenzyme A comes from the oxidation of pyruvate. So these amino acids, alanine, glycine, threonine, cysteine, serine, and tryptophan, can be converted to pyruvate, which will then be oxidized to acetyl coenzyme A and will start the citric acid cycle by combining with oxaloacetate. Asparagine and aspartate can be converted into oxaloacetate. And as long as there is a source of acetyl coenzyme A, that will cause the first step or the first chemical reaction in the citric acid cycle to begin, which is, of course, oxaloacetate combines with acetyl coenzyme A and forms citric acid or citrate, which is a 6-carbon molecule. Now, these amino acids, leucine, lysine, phenylalanine, tyrosine, and tryptophan, can be converted to a chemical called acetoacetate, and that chemical can be converted to acetyl coenzyme A. And you know, we could just go on and on and on talking about different chemicals that these amino acids can be converted to, but the point is they enter the citric acid cycle at some point and will produce various amounts of ATP. They may not produce as much ATP as a molecule of glucose, and they may produce more. So now we're going to talk about how cellular respiration is regulated. Regulation of cellular respiration. It is regulated by hormonal control, and you may know the name of that hormone. Well, there's more than one, but the one that we think of is insulin. Insulin regulates the entry of glucose into the cell. And of course, that relates to the disease diabetes, and we will discuss that. Enzyme reversibility or irreversibility. So whether or not the enzyme can reverse the chemical reaction or not, and we will discuss how that works. Enzyme sensitivity to pH changes. And then feedback controls. So when we look at the regulatory mechanism using insulin, we can look at this cell, for example, and that cell could be a muscle cell in a human, or it could be more than likely a liver cell. So this is what happens when insulin is released by the pancreas, and it eventually attaches to an insulin receptor on the surface of a liver cell. Once that happens, it triggers a vesicle inside that cell containing a carrier protein called GLUT4. It's a glucose transporter. That vesicle fuses with the membrane, as you can see over here, and it brings glucose into the cell from your blood. Out here somewhere is your blood. You've just eaten a meal, your blood sugar is high. It's bringing glucose from your blood into this liver cell where it is stored as glycogen, which is a polysaccharide, which is a long chain of many glucose molecules. So a person who is not diabetic will have a pancreas that produces this insulin and allows the liver cells and muscle cells will do this when you exercise, to bring glucose in from the blood and lower blood glucose levels. Then this is a, oh, I thought it was going to say something on the next slide, but it didn't. Okay, so someone who is a type 2 diabetic will produce actually an overabundance of insulin. They'll produce too much insulin a lot of times. Their cells become resistant to that insulin. And instead of the insulin causing the glucose carriers to bring in glucose from the blood, the blood glucose remains high. This process where the glucose carriers are bringing glucose in and lowering blood glucose, it doesn't happen. It's not effective. So the liver cells have become resistant to the insulin. We say it's called insulin resistance. And that person can either be pre-diabetic or maybe they have gone into type 2 diabetes. Now, a person with type 1 diabetes doesn't make insulin at all. So if there is no insulin, it doesn't bind to the receptors, and glucose in the blood remains high. So that is why a type 1 diabetic must take insulin injections. Now, feedback controls through different pathways and different enzymes are shown here, and it shows the effect on the right side. So in glycolysis, there's an enzyme called hexokinase, and it will elevate levels of glucose 6-phosphate. And when those levels are elevated, the pathway activity decreases. So it slows down cellular respiration. If during glycolysis, another enzyme is phosphofructokinase, which elevates levels of fructose 6-phosphate and causes cellular respiration to increase. And then we also have during glycolysis elevated levels of citric acid. And elevated levels of citric acid will cause the pH to drop, to decrease, and a low pH will cause cellular respiration to decrease. And this can actually happen in a type 1 diabetic. I have a daughter who has type 1 diabetes, so I can tell you this from experience that in a type 1 diabetic, when their blood glucose levels are high, their blood pH will be low. They'll have acidic, they'll go into what's called acidosis. And when their blood pH is low, it will cause cellular respiration to decrease. It will also cause their breathing. They will begin to hyperventilate to try and get rid of they will try to, they're trying to get rid of the increased carbon dioxide that comes from that acidic pH, or that contributes to that acidic pH, because the more carbon dioxide they can breathe out, their pH won't drop as low. So that's what they're doing, is their cellular respiration is decreasing so they can produce less carbon dioxide. They're trying to decrease their carbon dioxide production. And they do this by decreasing cellular respiration, and also they will increase their breathing rate. They will hyperventilate. They will increase breathing to try and breathe out all the CO2 that they can. That's just one of the body's ways of trying to keep them from going too far into the ketoacidosis. Now, you can look at this list if you want to. Just look down at the electron transport chain. When there are elevated levels of ADP, it causes the cellular respiration and the electron transport chain to increase. And when there are elevated levels of ATP, it causes the electron transport chain component of cellular respiration to decrease. And this is a very good example. All of these are examples of negative feedback, but it's a very good example. When you have elevated levels of ATP, it means you have enough. You don't need to keep making ATP when you have plenty of it. But when you have elevated levels of ADP, it means you don't have, that means you have low ATP. And so that is telling your cells to increase the activities of the electron transport chain. So I didn't know that was the last slide. Okay, so basically you can look through, and you can look through these pathways and the enzymes that are affected and elevated levels of chemicals, and you can see that some of these chemicals will increase cellular respiration and some will decrease cellular respiration. You can see a couple of examples here where elevated levels of ADP lead to an increase in cellular respiration, and elevated levels of ATP lead to a decrease. Here's another example, another example, another example that lead to a decrease in cellular respiration. So that's really just a negative feedback mechanism that's saying if we have high levels of ATP, we need to slow down because we're making enough. And if we have high levels of ADP, that corresponds with low levels of ATP. So we need to increase cellular respiration because we don't have enough ATP for the cells to get the energy that they need. So I am actually, since we have the time, I am going to go ahead and do an overview. Let me move my face out of the way. I'm going to do an overview really quickly, hopefully quickly, with you of cellular respiration, starting with glycolysis. Glycolysis produces 2 ATP directly, and then it produces 2 NADH. The oxidation of pyruvate, I'm just going to write pyruvate. The oxidation of pyruvate produces 2 NADH molecules, no ATP. I'm going to circle the ATPs because what I'm doing is trying to show you where the ATP comes from. The citric acid cycle produces 2 ATPs directly. So that's 4 out of our 36. And it produces 6 NADH and 2 FADH2. So where does the rest of our ATP come from? Well, every NADH molecule almost always produces 3 ATPs from the electron transport chain and chemiosmosis. So we can go back to every NADH and multiply times 3. And every FADH2 and multiply times 2. And if you count these numbers up, the 4, the 18, the 6, and the 2, and the 2, you will get 38, I believe, and that is your total ATP from